1. I grew up in a sheltered household, where my parents were overprotective and always cautioned me to be wary of everything around me. It would range from not letting me stay at my friend's house for a sleepover, due to fear of me getting raped by their dad, to not letting me shop with my friends by ourselves, unless there was a parent supervising us the entire time. They would also warn me about strangers, kidnappers, stalkers, etc. Note, I understand that these things are very much valid concerns in society, but I was young, and thought these dangers were few and far in between in my country. Dad gave me this whole spiel, and they explained that one of the reasons why they warned me repeatedly was because I look very young for my age, and people may think I'm gullible and an easy target. It also doesn't help that I was 5'2" then, and at the height of a child. I started to tone them out after a while, which was a pretty stupid idea on my part. I'll explain why in a little bit. This occurrence happened in the summer of me transitioning from a freshman to sophomore in high school. It was about 8:30 p.m. and the sun was setting, but it was still fairly bright outside. It was bright enough that the streetlights weren't lit, and the cars on the road didn't need to have their evening headlights on to see properly. My sibling and I used to go to a tutoring center, which was smack dab in the middle of a residential area. Since we'd been frequenting the center at the same location for years, and the neighborhood seemed relatively nice and family-friendly, I thought I'd just take a stroll around the residential area as I waited for my sibling to finish up their weekly test. Our dad would pick up both of us after we were finished our tests and head home, as it would be more efficient to just do one trip instead of two, as my house was a bit of a ways away. I almost always finished my tests sooner than my sibling did, so oftentimes I'd have a lot of spare time to wait. I'd usually have a book with me, but that week I didn't, so I opted for the stroll. This area has a nice playground that's usually frequented by families and their children, toddlers really, which was why I thought it'd be safe for a 16-year-old to be walking around by themselves. I mean, parents wouldn't want their toddlers in a playground that would be slightly dangerous, right? I knew the neighborhood fairly well, so I started walking by myself around the block, and as I walked past the playground, thought I'd call one of my friends to chat about something fairly insignificant in our lives. I had planned that I would only walk half a block before turning back, because I remembered my parents' warnings about how people will just randomly stalk children because reasons, and I should try to remain in a more populated area. I should also look over my shoulder every so often to make sure that no one was following me, as an additional safety measure. I thought this time, because it was still bright out, and as I was on the phone with somebody who will know if I go missing, I'll ignore their advice and do my own thing, but I shouldn't have. I got caught up in the phone call I had made, and before I knew it, had walked a good couple blocks from the tutoring center. I whirled around and planned to head back the way I came before I saw a man, about 5'6" to 5'8", with a shock of white greyish hair, standing about 10 feet from me, dressed in a forest green windbreaker, baggy blue jeans, and some brown shoes. I would not have noticed anything strange had he, 1, not just abruptly stopped and stared straight at me, 2, veered straight into a throng of evergreen trees next to a bunch of townhouses to his left, my right, so I couldn't see his face anymore, and 3, his face was as red as a tomato. My friend on the phone was asking me if everything was okay because I literally stopped talking due to my surprise. I quietly said that I had to go because something didn't quite feel right with what I'd just seen. In hindsight, probably shouldn't have done that. I stayed standing there for a minute or two, facing the direction from where I came from, trying to see if the guy who just abruptly stopped when he saw me look at him had entered one of the townhouses. I wanted to confirm that maybe my paranoia was playing tricks on me, and that he was actually just a resident of one of the townhouses in that strip. But then I noticed that peeking out from beneath the evergreens were his brown shoes with the baggy blue jeans spilling over them, and they weren't moving. He was still facing me behind the cover of the trees, and even though I couldn't see his face behind them, I could feel his eyes on me, and it was disconcerting. To make matters worse, on the opposite side of the street from the townhouses was an apartment complex, and two men had just exited it, and were jaywalking across the street to where I was then standing. Starting to get scared shitless, thinking that all three of these men were in on trying to kidnap me or worse. I quickly turned around and started walking real fast towards the intersection, about another block from where I was. I flipped my brick phone open. Nokia, I swear. Sped dialed my house number and hoped that my dad hadn't gone out of the house to pick up my sibling and I at the tutoring centre yet, as he did not have a cell phone back then. When my dad picked up, I was already at the intersection where all these cars were bustling by. This intersection was at a main street. I was so relieved and started blurting out how happy I was I managed to catch him before he had left the house, and how I wanted to get picked up at the 7-Eleven a couple blocks away from the tutoring centre. He didn't ask any questions, aside from whether or not my sibling was still at the tutoring centre, and I had said yes. He picked me up in record time, and asked why I was at a 7-Eleven instead of at the tutoring centre like I should be, and why I couldn't have just walked back. I then told him how there was this middle-aged guy who suddenly stopped and stared at me when I turned around to try to walk back to the centre, who then beelined it for the trees to cover himself when I spotted him. I mentioned how my body was telling me it was all shades of wrong to walk past this guy, so I booked it to 7-Eleven to be around somewhere safer with surveillance cameras. My dad was livid and demanded to know if I saw where this guy had walked off to. I said no, and my dad started driving around the neighbourhood as we still had some time to kill before picking up my sibling. When we drove past a shopping area close to my neighbourhood, I spotted the guy walking in the direction of the liquor store, but kept my mouth shut. I don't know why I didn't tell my dad that the guy was right there as we circled the area in our car, but I was afraid that maybe I had made a big deal out of nothing, and maybe the guy wasn't actually going to do something bad and was just a weirdo. Whatever it was, it definitely taught me to look behind me every few seconds when I'm walking by myself in broad daylight, and especially at night time. 2. This incident happened when I was about 11, nearly 12. Now for a bit of background information. At that age I had already started developing early on, so I would get unwanted attention from adult males. At the time I never understood why, and I only wore shirts under my clothes instead of a usual training bra so things weren't that visible, though you could still kinda see. The area I lived in at the time wasn't the best, but due to my mother being a single parent, and only having one source of income, this is where I called home. It was a seemingly presentable looking apartment complex on the outside, though the residents who lived there knew it was anything but. We lived there in total of 3 years, though due to the rising incidents that happened to us, we were forced to move. When we first moved in, crime in this area was not a problem, so we wouldn't sweat it. And to mention that there were a lot of children in the complex, so I thought, hey, nothing bad could happen over here. It's a family place. It's completely safe. Having this state of mind, I would usually go outside to sit on our front porch during the summers to play with my dog when I got bored in the house. Where I live, it gets extremely hot during this time, so I had on a tank top and shorts. I remember it was around 5:30 p.m, and it seemed to be completely still outside. It seemed as though no one was out, so it was just me and my puppy. He was about 2 at the time. Now to me, he was extremely protective and very alert. Sadly, I was not. As I was wrestling with him, I hear a rustle in the bushes about 10 feet away from me, to the right, but I pay it no mind and continue to play with him, though now my puppy seems very tense. About 5 minutes later, I hear it again, and so does he, but this time he loses his playful spirit and goes into full-on guard mode. Ears perked, chest poked out, and eyes scanning. Now please understand something. I was always a very timid child. If I heard anything, I damn sure was not about to go investigate it. My mother was upstairs asleep since she worked night shifts, and due to this, I didn't want to bother her, though she didn't know I was outside anyway. I see no matter how much I try to get him, to keep playing, he just won't budge. I turn to where he's looking, and I see a man. Very rough looking, but I knew I had seen him before, and he must have lived in the complex. He had a dirty wife beater that looked beer-stained, dark blue jeans, and work boots. He was standing behind the bush next to the building staring at me. I saw his hand moving rapidly, and at the time I had no idea what he was doing. I now know what he was doing behind that bush. All the while he was doing this, he was muttering something under his breath and tried to take a step forward, closer to me. But instead of me running, I was frozen. My dog at this point let out the most vicious growl and snarled at this man, which snapped me out of my frozen state immediately, and I screamed for my mother, running up the stairs as quickly as I could. When I got up the stairs, she had heard me and quickly rushed to me, though I didn't want to worry her, knowing she had to work that night. So I just brushed it off with some excuse and sent her back off to bed. I thought this was over. Wrong again. Fast forward to about 3 days later, and my feeble mind had forgotten about the incident, but I didn't go back outside alone. It was night time now, and me and my mom had come back from one of our mommy-daughter days at the movies. It was around 12:30, and we had just gotten home. Me, being hyped up on cotton candy and sodas, was off my guard again, though my mother was not. I always joke with her about how, even now, she has the hearing of a dog, though I didn't know it would come in handy tonight. One thing about my mother is she wasn't very threatening, standing at only 5'5", though she had lots of muscle in her, from working on the ambulance as an EMT. Another thing is, regardless of where she was, she always had a switchblade that she could pop out faster than lightning if she needed to. As we shut the car off, we both noticed that the streetlight illuminating our building was off. We both looked at each other in a what the fuck realization. It was pitch black now, though every other light was on in front of the other buildings but ours. Me being scary, this knocked out all the hyper feelings I had. I was not attentive. As I was getting out of the car, I noticed that I heard a rustle behind the bushes, like I had heard 3 days ago. I stopped dead in my tracks outside of the car and looked at my mother without speaking, asking her, "Did you hear that?" Though only through my eyes. She never misses a beat. Her eyes were already trained on the bushes to my right. Deciding to play it cool like we didn't hear them, we continued to get our bags out of the car. As we shut them, it seemed time stood still. The pathway for us to get to our building was Y-shaped, and the realization hit that this person was literally 5 feet away from me, dressed in all black with a hoodie on and hands in his pockets. I could feel the ill intent meant for us. As we got to the front of our car, I looked at her and she looked at me, knowing this meant, on the count of 3, run. By now my heart was beating out of my chest, and on 3 I booked it to the front door and threw it open, running quickly up our steps, running with key in hand. Though I ran with my mother behind me, I could hear a third pair of feet were running too. I had cleared 5 feet between me and the door, and about 20 steps in 10 seconds with my mother in tow. Since our door to the building was incredibly hard to open once slammed, she shut it tightly behind her, waking up my sleeping dog upstairs in the process, and he started barking like crazy. I could hear the door handle jiggling, trying to be forced open as me and my mother finally stepped in our apartment. We heard the building door slam open and footsteps running up through. By this time the door was locked and barricaded. My dog growled and jumped at the door, and in hearing this, I think scared whoever was there away, because all that was heard was retreating footsteps out of the building and around the side of the building into a very thick brush. We called the police, but they said there was nothing they could do about it. I even told my mom, finally, of the man I saw, and she knew who he was. Let's just say I had to stop her from popping a cap in his ass and getting locked up, since the police told us to mind our business and get used to it, since, and I quote, using his words, "Women should be in the house anyway." 3. This happened about 5 years ago to a very close friend and I. I will try my best to get this out as coherently as possible. I lived just outside of a small village in Canada. When I say small, I mean blink and you will miss it. So I was used to quiet nights, broken by the sound of coyotes and crickets. When I was 19, going on 20, I ended up going to university in Toronto. It was such a huge change for me, as I wasn't used to having so many people around me all the time. I moved into residence, as my village was far enough away that I wasn't able to commute at all. Now, the residence was huge. There were 3 buildings, with many, many floors. You needed your room card to get through the front door, past the reception desk. Your friends needed to sign out a pass in order to visit. And even then, you couldn't visit for more than a few days at a time. I met my best friend, Sarah, a couple of months after moving in, and we became inseparable. We were always at the other person's dorm room, laughing and having fun. I lived a floor above her. Nothing weird happened straight off the bat, but it didn't take long for the two of us to start to notice things. I remember hanging out in her room one night, having a few drinks and watching some TV. We got to talking about creepy things, and that's when she told me that she thought someone was looking into her room at night. She lives on the ground floor. This freaked me out, and when I told her so, she just kind of shrugged and told me that she couldn't be sure. It could just be someone walking out on the path or something. I'm sure it's nothing. She wouldn't hear otherwise about the topic. About a week later, we were again in her room. Her TV was in front of her window at the end of her bed, which we were sitting on. I remember the light was off and we were laughing about something or other when she suddenly sat up, staring at the window. "What is it, Sarah?" "Shh." She turned down her TV and ran for the window, yanking back the curtains. I watched her relax a bit and give me a nervous grin. I thought I saw someone looking in my window. I must be getting paranoid, huh? She laughed and settled back on her bed. "Maybe we should tell the RA?" I asked. She shot that down, telling me that there was no proof and she didn't want to seem crazy. You know, first time away from home, jumping at every little shadow. Now, a little backstory on the view outside her window. When you look out, you can see a bit of an open area before a slope down. The window was small enough that you couldn't see much on either side. It would be easy to hide from someone looking out. I remember thinking that time and again. This happened on and off for a few weeks until finally, we got some proof. I remember walking into her room. She had told me that she needed to show me something, wondering what she needed me for. She pulled back her curtains and said that now she knew that someone was looking in her window. You could clearly see where someone licked her window, right where the curtains meet in the middle, with a nose print right above it. I flipped. We called the RA, who seemed deeply disturbed by this. He said that they would do everything they could to figure it out, but to keep the curtains closed and to immediately report any other incidents. From there, it seemed to get more frequent and creepier at the same time. There were footprints right outside her window during winter, or right after it rained. We would find full-on handprints and food wrappers littering outside. It jumped from one spot, where the person licked the window, to multiple. It got so bad that she was afraid to be alone. She would spend as much time outside of her dorm room as she could, only using the room to sleep in. She refused to keep her window open while she slept, afraid that whoever it was would cut the screen and force themselves inside. I would sometimes sleep in her room, and we would wake up just to see if anything happened. It wasn't unusual for stuff to happen while I was there too. I remember the ground floor calling a meeting, telling the others that there was a peeping Tom harassing one of the residents, her, and that if it was happening to anyone else, they needed to come forward. We found out later that Sarah wasn't the only one. She ended up leaving right after second semester started, not for this reason. And I wasn't friends with anyone else on the floor below me, so I don't know if it kept happening. No one was caught. What I remember the most about this entire experience was the feeling of constantly being watched and never really feeling safe. It really creeped me out and opened my eyes to the fact that this can happen to anyone. So, dude who creeped on me and my friend through her window, let's not meet. Edit. Okay, so apparently a peeping Tom was arrested that same year I was there. But I don't think it was him. I'm going to do some more digging in the morning and maybe update it if I find anything. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 94. For some reason I can't get this bloody thing recorded. This is the 3rd time trying. Fingers crossed it actually works this time. Okay. This is the last week for questions for the Q&A. So if you do have any, please get them in before, let's say before next Sunday. Or this coming Sunday when you're listening to this. Yeah, I think that should be fine. So, either in the comment section of any video, on Twitter, Facebook, and I think that's about it really. Those are probably the best options. I'm afraid I'm going to have to make it a bit of a short outro this episode. A few matters to go and attend to. I'm going to get a jump in a few things. So I'm going to rush off and do that now. So, until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.